Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your 10-minute fix of ancient warfare-related stuff for the week to take you away from whatever crises or things are happening in your everyday week as we talk about ancient warfare or ancient history more generally, which is kind of what today's topic will be, which we'll get to in just a second. Of course, you can ask us a question, send us an email, make a comment in any forum that you see this in. As I've said before, we do indeed get to all your comments eventually, even if we don't reply, we do see them. And of course, you can send us a letter, send us an email, send us a postcard, send us a telegram, all of those things. Anyway, you can, of course, also support us on Patreon /Ancient Warfare Podcast and back us at one of three different levels. Now, today's question comes from Diocletian, I believe, maybe on Twitter. It's an @ so maybe, I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, X, not called Twitter anymore. Anyway, how come we don't have much information on Aurelian and Probus, etc., but Diocletian is apparently well documented in the histories Augusta? Okay, so the first thing, Diocletian isn't in the Histories Augusta or the SHA, the Scriptores Historiae Augustae. That essentially gives us the emperors from Hadrian to Numerianus, so 117 AD to 284, just before Diocletian comes to power, which actually, Diocletian, even is further to your point. Why don't we hear so much about these other emperors? And of course, there are many emperors, especially in the 3rd century AD, who we know very little about, even though we do, in fact, have quite a bit of information about them. And Diocletian, who was missing from the SHA, we do get a lot of information on. And I think the reason for that is that history has always regarded Diocletian as important, the dominant, the creation of the Caesars and the Augustes, the splitting of the empire, the idea of creating the tetrarchy, the reforms to the army, the recovery of the empire after the 3rd century crisis. These are all things that Diocletian is responsible for. He's also unusual in the sense that he's the only Roman emperor to successfully retire. And so that in a way sort of marks him out as being the one that more attention is paid to because he's more important. It's only really been in recent times and really in the rise of publications, which are sort of easier to produce, if you like, where we're starting to get biographies of these other emperors who in some cases no one's ever heard of. So, and there's also been a sort of a trend in recent scholarship to also reassess some of these emperors and see them as more important and responsible for things that they may not have been given credit for in the past, or like with Aurelian, sort of the precursor to a more important reform later, generally under Diocletian, although in some cases other emperors too. So in a way, you've got that sort of idea of chipping away at Diocletian's importance, which I don't think is necessary. But there's also the problem that, are we giving credit to these other candidates when they don't really deserve that credit? And sort of, there's a lot of scholarship out there of I had a colleague who used to talk about seeing the beloved everywhere. And I think we're all guilty of that as historians. When we have a pet topic, we see its relevance in any topic that's brought up to us as a matter of conversation. We'll see, our topic within that topic, even if the person telling us about the other topic can't see the relevance. And that's certainly something I think most scholars are guilty of. So if you've got a 3rd century AD emperor who you think has been slighted by the historical tradition, you're going to see their importance / relevance / comparative moments throughout history when possibly no one else has done that. We've had that with Gallienus and other emperors, Maximinus Thrax and others recently. So, for instance, when we go to the primary sources, and look, I haven't even touched on whether the SHA is reliable. The SHA, we think, is written in the 4th century, probably by a single author, although there are 6 different authors' names listed as the authors of the works in the SHA. And even now, today, you'll still find people referring to a particular biography within the SHA as being by that author, that pseudonym And so it's a bit of a problem. There is information that is useful in the SHA. At the same time, there is information that is clearly spurious. He quotes imperial letters, which clearly he's just made up. And so it's a real issue to go through the SHA and try and work out what the reliable information is versus what's the unreliable information. Very often we have corroborative accounts, but probably as often we have contradictory accounts. And I think the issue has been that the SHA has been immediately discounted in comparison to the other accounts. And weirdly, when they corroborate, oh, that's just an accident, which I don't believe. And often, if you look at the account in Dio Cassius, for instance, his might be the spurious one, in which case perhaps the SHA, which disagrees with him, might be the one that's more reliable. But that's not something that anyone's really been able to do. And I think throughout ancient history, there are various authors who've suffered from that. Diodorus Siculus, for instance, is often regarded as the lesser source of Alexander, for instance, or the 4th century BC before Alexander. Often he's the only source. So it's like, well, ignore him at your peril. But he's also much earlier than, say, Arrian for Alexander. So rejecting him seems basically something just to do. And, we know he used Ephorus and other sources. And obviously he disagrees with Xenophon, but I think Xenophon's tricky. He's doing all sorts of strange things propagandistically and omitting things which people like to rely on Xenophon, but I don't know that he's that reliable. Anyway, I'm getting digressed. I am digressing from our question, which of course is Probus and Aurelian. Those are the two named. There are many other emperors in the 3rd century. So the SHA, for instance, the biography of Aurelian, it's in the 2nd volume of the L'Herbe. It's also in the Penguin translation. It's 50 pages of Aurelian biography. Probus, 25 pages. So they're not tiny. Other books of similar length do the 30 tyrants, and we get double biographies of the Maximini and the Valeri, for instance. So there's quite a bit of information on them. Whether it's reliable or not is something you need to do and go through. So at the same time, there are other sources of these emperors. And of course, there are some emperors in the SHA that we've got very little information on. There are other emperors who only exist in coinage, not even mentioned by the SHA unless they're in one of the 30, for instance. So, for instance, for Aurelian, we've got, in addition to the SHA, Eutropius, Aurelius Victor, Zosimus, and the epitome of Dio Cassius made by Zonoras in the 12th century. So there's a range of sources for him. Probus, similarly, you've got Aurelius Victor, Eutropius, Zonoras, and Zosimus. So again, Zosimus is rejected. Aurelius Victor and Eutropius are writing quite short biographies, quite short sections on these bits of history. And Zonoras is obviously epitomizing Cassius Dio's much longer account into a much shorter account, but it's all we have. So in both their cases, we've got the same sort of sources that deal with them. Outside of those, and again, when we look at Diocletian, we've got the same, Zonoras, the Eutropius, Aurelius Victor. But we've also got Eusebius, Lactantius, the Latin panegyrics, the 12 Latin panegyrics, Aurelius Victor, and some of the laws of Diocletian make it into the Justinian Code. So in that sense, there's more on Diocletian. We don't, for instance, have the books on any of them in Ammianus Marcellinus. Ammianus Marcellinus's books pick up in 353 AD, so we're missing all of that period before it. And he often refers to his earlier books, which unfortunately don't survive. So I think that the major reason that we have less information or less focus on these other emperors, but it is changing, is because they're regarded as less important than Diocletian is. And, if you look at the brief biographies that you can find of these emperors online, you'll find exactly that. They're dealt with much, much faster. And that may be because their reigns are very short. Probus is emperor from 276 to 282. Aurelian is emperor from, let me find it, 270 to 275. Now, only 5 years and 6 years for Probus. And of course, Diocletian is emperor for 20, from 284 to 305. So in that sense, you would expect there to be less on them. But in the context of the 3rd century, those 2 reigns of 5 years and 6 years are remarkably stable, given that we have other emperors who last days. And, we all talk about the year of the 4 emperors in 68 AD. Sorry, 69 AD, gosh, not 68, 69 AD. But there are other years within the 3rd century where there's 6 emperors, even more in a single year, lots of usurpers declaring their own candidacy. So the fact that you've got these relatively long reigns, 5 years and 6 years, within that context means they're probably more important than people give them credit for. So watch this space, I suppose, for more material to look at Probus and to look at Aurelian and some of the other emperors of the 3rd century and give them credit where perhaps it hasn't been paid in the past. So I hope that answers your question, Diocletian. And we look forward to answering another one at the next Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.